Let us bow our heads in prayer. Dear Father, thank you for this corner in Genesis. And the plot is thickening as we go into the story of how you somehow frame the descendants and the ancestors of Jesus Christ so that we can appreciate your hand moving through history, making it possible for the seed of Abraham to be born. As we open the second part of the story of Jacob and wrestling with God, may the Spirit touch our hearts in a very, very deep way as we grapple with this reality that happens to all of us. Again, make us teachable, make us humble. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, so we go to lesson 10. We had Jacob the supplanter in Sabbath school, the last lesson. Now we go to Jacob part 2, which is Jacob Israel, the transitioning of Jacob to a new name, Israel. So let me set this up by saying there is a projection of a utopian desert city, Tolosa, which is the pet project of Mark Lore, the former president of Walmart e-commerce and co-founder of Jetcom and Diapers.com. He's saying they're targeting a city to be built in the American West Desert or the Appalachia, with plans to shepherd in a reformed version of capitalism with a focus on social inclusion over division. He envisions equal access healthcare, excellent schooling, and safe environments for families, regardless of income. Even further, he aims for Tolosa to be a diverse place housing various races, genders, sexual orientation, religions, and political affiliations. So by the definition, they're thinking of a utopian desert city, and they're opening up applications for this. I think the projected population, if I may be right, is about 1 million or so. Which will to the tune of $400 billion in development. So supposedly because of the climate change threat that we are facing right now globally, and in line on the heels of Bill Gates' attempt to build a utopian city, Mark Lore thought of this. He said, once you are approved to live in this community, healthcare, education, equality among people. This is just a paradise. It's a utopia. Basically, that's what they're saying. Okay, so there's only one thing that they forget. However conducive the environment is and the city is to the best you can think of in terms of lifestyle, human nature does not change. And only one person who tries to exercise the greed and the depravity within himself can be an instrument to destroy the entire utopia. Remember what Malcolm Muggeridge said, the depravity of men is at once the most empirically verifiable reality, but at the same time, the most intellectually resisted fact. So we try to build this utopia around us, try to improve society by behavior modification and what have you. But still, you cannot eliminate the total depravity, the depravity of the human nature within heart. So, as it was described by the Minnesota Crime Commission, they released the statement. It says, if permitted to continue in the self-centered world of his infancy, that's a child, every child would grow up a criminal, a thief, a killer, or a rapist. Because we are internally depraved. That's the total depravity, the sinful nature of man. In fact, Billy Graham, who was invited to speak at the TED conference, a technical conference in 1998, he was the only one who dealt with the sphere, the area of religion. He talks about the marvels of technologies, just even before Y2K, the power to improve lives and change the world. But he says, with all the technology available in our hands right now, there is still evil, suffering, and death. And the end of evil, suffering, and death will come only after the world accepts Christ. So with this in mind, we have a perspective of what's going on in Genesis. The reason why God had to call Abraham from Or the Chaldees, after the incident of the Tower of Babel and the confusion that led there, was for God to form a nation from which the Messiah will come. Because until the Messiah comes, suffering, death, and meaninglessness, and pain, and evil will still be there. But when Jesus comes, then there will be a solution to all these maladies that the sin has brought upon us. So let's look at a review of what happened here in this table of genealogies. We know that Noah had 3 sons: Japheth, Ham, and Shem. Okay, and those are the texts that we cover this. Remember, Shem are the Semites, which are the Jews. This is where the line of Abraham eventually comes. That you see Abraham right there. And Canaan, of course, coming from Ham, are the Canaanites, where God called Abraham to go. And you know the story. They went to Egypt because of the famine. They were taken into slavery. They had to come back and conquer the land of Canaan. Okay, and Japheth, meanwhile, hits the northern part towards Europe, and that's where humankind began again after the flood. The journey of Abraham, as we covered in our studies, basically came from Ur. They eventually went to Haran, and as soon as they got to Haran, Haran died there, and they're saying the reason why he called Haran because Haran died there. Then he eventually goes and arrives in the Promised Land, and because of a famine, he moves to Egypt, and then after the famine, he goes back and returns to the Promised Land. If we were to look at the patriarchs that we've been covering so far, including this lesson and the past lesson, we will see the journeys of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see how expansive the journey of Abraham was. We kind of covered that. Isaac didn't go far. If you look at the journeys of Isaac, which is purple right here, he was just right here going into Bethel, Shechem, around that area. Now, when we go to the journeys of Jacob, now he will span almost the length and the breadth of the journey of Abraham, because you know what happened. He had to run away from his brother who wants to kill him. So he came from Canaan. He went all the way to Padan Aram, okay, and then went to Haran, and obviously he came back to Canaan because God called him again to go there. And along the way, remember, Bethel was there where he had the vision of the angels of God in a staircase going up and down, and God communicating with him. Now, to put this further into perspective, this is the family of Abraham. You got Terah, and Terah had Haran, the father of Lot, and the daughter of Lot. Remember, in Sodom, the Moabites and Ammonites came from there. And Haran had a daughter named Milcah. Milcah became the wife of Nahor, who is the brother of Abraham. And Nahor gave birth to Bethuel, and Bethuel had Laban and Rebekah. And that's where the connection is, because Abraham and Sarai gives birth to Isaac, and Isaac, when he was looking for a wife, ended up marrying Rebekah, happens to be the sister of Laban right here. And of course, after that, we also talk about Ishmael because they tried to circumvent God's plan. But after Isaac married Rebekah, then Jacob and Esau were born. We will cover that today. And out of Esau were the Edomites, and Jacob, obviously, who became Israel, were the Israelites. Okay, that's where the seed of Abraham will come. That was the design. To put it in a better perspective, this is the breakdown of what happened in the genealogy of Abraham. And you can see that I made the lineage of the Messiah in blue. So you can see that there. Once you see the handout, it'll probably help you. So Abraham goes outside all of these names and all of these people. Comes Isaac, and Isaac goes to Jacob and all the way to Judah. And if you want any the corresponding verses, you can check out the verses right there in the handout. What's the most important thing to understand is the promised seed and the messianic line. You go there in this background, beginning with Eve. There was the seed of the woman that was promised, and then the seed of Abraham, and Abraham had the covenant with God. Isaac was born, then Jacob came, and then Jacob eventually gave the birthright to Judah. And Judah eventually, from Judah came David, and you have the seed of David, and then Mary, of course, and then the seed who happens to be Jesus in the end. So you got humanity, which is the Son of Man, the messianic line. We got nation, the son of Abraham, are the nations. Now we talk about the 12 tribes, the line of Judah, where Judah is there. And then we talk about family, which is the line of David, and eventually the Father, which is the Son of God. Remember, unto us a child is born, a son is given. A child is born, but the son is not born. It is given because the son has already been there from the Father. Something very interesting that was brought up in the studies, they saying that after Sarai died, Abraham married Keturah. And when Keturah became the wife of Abraham, they had more children, as you look at the previous handout. And a lot of rabbis and a lot of Old Testament teachers and scholars are saying that Keturah and Hagar are the same persons. So they somehow deduce that from 1 Chronicles 1:31 to 33. They infer that because it says these are the sons of Ishmael. It enumerates names of the sons of Ishmael. And immediately after that, it says the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine. She bore Zimran and so on and so on. At the back end, all these were the descendants of Keturah. So the rabbis are asking, why is Ishmael mentioned here, but Hagar is not? Instead of Hagar being mentioned, it talks about other children who are now the sons of Keturah. So they're saying, more than likely, Keturah and Hagar are the same. But I'd like to point out that it is not so much, by the way, let me just go back there. They're saying that somehow, if Keturah was a different woman from Hagar, it will be complete because Isaac came from Shem, Keturah came from Ham because he was an Egyptian, and Hagar came from Ham, and Keturah came from Japheth. So you got all the three kids of Noah covering the promise that God said, "In you shall all the nations be blessed." But there's something missing in that interpretation because the blessing on all nations does not depend on the children of Noah. It depends on the coming seed of Abraham, who happens to be Jesus Christ. So this is the lineage of Jesus through the sons of Jacob and the tribes of Israel. This is the breakdown. We know that although Jacob fell in love with Rachel, God closed Rachel's womb. And when he opened it, he had Joseph and Benjamin. And there's the breakdown. And Jacob eventually had children of the slave of Leah and the slave of Rachel. And we come up with all the 12 tribes. Okay, of course, there's a daughter, it's named Dinah. So this is the lineage that comes. And as you can see, Judah eventually gets the birthright from Jacob, and from where King David comes, and King Solomon, all the way, the kings of Judah, all the way when we go to Jesus. Now, where are we situated in our study in this lesson? Okay, this is a timeline that will help you understand this. Abraham and Sarah leave Haran. Abraham was 175 years old. And when Ishmael was born, she was 127 years old. Isaac marries Rebekah when he was 40 years old. And then Esau and Jacob, when Isaac was 60 years old, were born. Okay, Isaac was 180 years when Esau marries local wives. Jacob eventually dies, but he lives for 147 years. And Joseph goes to Egyptian prison, which will be the following lessons in our quarterly. Benjamin was born and Rachel died. Israel arrives in Egypt. Joseph lives for 110 years. Now, where do we study? We are in Haran. Jacob is in Haran. He is coming back to Canaan after he worked for Laban. And at that point, at the ford of the Jabbok ford, he wrestles with God. And that's our study for this lesson. So if you look at the timeline, you see all the years and the longevity of all these patriarchs. We are studying the wrestling of Jacob with God at the ford Jabbok. So we will cover our study in three movements towards God that Jacob made. And by looking at these three movements, hopefully we can bring things into perspective. The first movement that Jacob did was he wrestled with God. He kept on wrestling with God. The same night, he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. And the men wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. You got to understand, they're coming back from Haran, where Padam Aram, where Laban was, to go back to Canaan, where the promised land, where God told him to go. But there is a very big trepidation on the part of Jacob because Esau was there to kill him. He promised and swore, because he stole the birthright from his dad, that he will be there to kill Jacob. Okay, so if you want to have a better feel, I numbered this, so the number will help you. Jacob set out in haste from Beersheba and camped at Bethel. When after he deceived Isaac and stole the birthright from his brother, he ran and he went to Bethel, which was formerly Luz. That's where we see the movement of Jacob. And of course, he goes all the way to serve Laban in Haran. And it's a long, long way. Okay, house for 20 years before fleeing back to Canaan. So he spent 20 years in Haran. And then he takes off without saying goodbye to Laban, his father-in-law. Brings Rachel, Leah, their slaves, along with all the flocks and whatever riches he had, and flees Laban. Laban catches up with him, okay, and they made a pact about the country of Gilead. And right about this time, when they're here, closing onto Canaan, where he was supposed to return. By the way, Jacob never saw his mother again because Rebekah died. Okay, but he was supposed to return here, and that's where he wrestles with God in the river Jabbok, in the ford of Jabbok. And of course, Esau, whom he thought was about to kill him, forgot everything. He forgave his brother in the big reconciliation over there. So basically, this is Jacob's journey from Haran and back. As you can see, it's hundreds of miles to traverse. If you want a summary, of course, these are the children of the 12 tribes, but Jacob's journey was 77 years in Canaan. He stayed there for 77 years. He runs away for his dear life. He spends 20 years in Haran, and then he comes back 33 years in Canaan. That's wrong, it should be Haran. And 33 years in Canaan. And of course, after the famine, when Joseph brings them to Egypt, he lives another 17 years in Egypt. That's the background of Jacob's journey. So, how did Jacob begin to wrestle with God? And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. So, there were twins. Rebekah, again, miraculously was moved by the Spirit to have children because she was barren, as Sarah was. But God's kindness, of course, his orchestration for the Messiah to be born, allowed Rebekah to have twins. And right there in the womb of Sarah, God said, hey, you will have twins. But the older will serve the younger. So, that Esau was the older and Jacob was the younger. And God said, it is Jacob who will be chosen to be the ancestor of the coming seed. Okay? Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Even within the womb, Jacob became a heel grabber. He's a heel grabber. He's a supplanter. He holds the heel of Jacob. For us to have an idea what this is, there is a phenomenon today called twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome. It is a TTTS. Okay, and somehow if there are twins, they share placenta. Okay, and then the fluid as they move around. And every so often, while they share this part of the womb together, somehow the blood vessels cross. So that eventually one of the twins will have to feed the other. Okay, the one is the supplier, the other is the receiver, a provider. And then, so the twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome already happens. It's very rare, but it happens. This gives us an idea that even in the womb, there's already a wrestling going on. So even before Jacob was born, he was already wrestling for priority in his life. You know the story. Esau went hunting one day. He became so hungry. He tells Jacob, "Sell me your birthright now." So I cannot fault Jacob. You got to understand, Jacob was doing this thinking that he will fulfill God's promise because he's supposed to get the birthright. So, okay, sell me your birthright, says Jacob. And then Esau said, "I'm about to die. I'm about to die of hunger. What use is it for a birthright to me? So just give me the soup, the bean soup, and you can have my birthright." See, and of course, Jacob exploited his opportunity. And instead of legitimately telling his brother and his dad that God decided that he will take the birthright, he exploited the hunger of Esau so he can get the birthright. So you can argue that at this point, the birthright was relinquished by Esau to Jacob. So there's no reason to be mad, okay? But you know what happened, right? When Isaac was already blind and he wanted to give his blessing to the next person in line to have the birthright, Rebecca connived with Jacob so that they put goat skin and, so that he pretended, because Isaac couldn't see, that he was Esau. "I'm Esau, your firstborn. I've done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game that your soul may bless me." So here comes more of the wrestling. He wrestles by exploiting the hunger of his brother. Now he wrestles by lying to his father in order to get the birthright. I always in the back of my mind while I'm reading this, of course, I don't think Jacob was just doing it for himself. They were trying to fulfill God, and true to the mistake of Abraham and Sarah, tried to fulfill the promised seed because they couldn't bear children. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham, but that wasn't the way it's going to work. God had better plans. That's why Isaac was born. In the same token, they're trying to manipulate things in order for the promise of God to take effect by exploiting Esau and deceiving Isaac. And here's the promise: "Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you." Yeah, this is a blessing of Isaac to Jacob. And when Esau came, you know the story, and because all the blessing was given to Jacob, no blessing was left with Esau, and he got so mad. Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob," saying, "I will not do it right now while my father is still alive, but as soon as we bury our father, I swear that I will kill my brother." So that is a real threat. And of course, that's where Rebecca intervenes and says, "You got to go run to my brother in Laban so that you can save your life from your brother's intent in killing you." And you know the story. While Jacob wrestles in exploiting his brother and deceiving his father, he goes on his way to Haran, and along the way he goes to Bethel and sees the vision of the angels up and down the staircase going to heaven. And it's amazing. This is very interesting. "Then Jacob awake from his sleep and said, 'Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it.'" One of the problems of Jacob was he kept on wrestling with God because God has been there all along, but he did not recognize the presence of God. How quaint that's what happens to us. We think we want to follow God in our own way, when in fact God's there. Instead of listening to him, we try to do it with our own smarts and messes up the whole thing. Now, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Okay, this is very important because people are saying, "Oh, Esau was the hunter, he's a strong man, whereas Jacob was wimpy, he was a mama's boy." Well, you got to understand, read the context here. And he was looking for Rachel. And there was a well that they used to water the flock. There was a large stone there. It takes several shepherds to move that stone. And according to the story, now as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, coming, what he did was what did he do? He came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth so that Rachel can water the flock. By himself, that very big stone, he was able to move. So he was not the wimp. He was quite strong. And you will realize that during the wrestling match with God, he will prove his endurance and his strength during the time. So Jacob was strong, okay? Well, strong enough to wrestle against God, but very slowly God is teaching him that the futility of wrestling with him. So he works for Rachel for 7 years, because that's the tradition. She got to serve in order to get the right to marry the daughter of a particular chieftain or a patriarch in the tribe. And, after the big party of the wedding, Laban took Jacob, and you know how it is. It was in a hotel with lights. It was really dark, and Jacob was already drunk. And instead of giving Rachel, he gave Leah to Jacob. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? Why did you flee?" Well, you'll go back here. But why did you deceive me? I wanted Rachel. Oh, and then Laban said, "Well, it's our tradition, our custom to have the older daughter marry first before the younger." So Jacob works for another 7 years for the right to get Rachel into marriage. Again, he was strict by Laban. And you know the story, he eventually became prosperous. He had flocks, all sorts of riches that he gained, probably because he committed a tenth of a tithe in Bethel with God. So on his way back, he said, because I know that the Laban and the other kids are getting mad at me. They're planning to kill me. Let me leave with my family and go back to where I came from, the Canaan. So while they were on their way, Laban pursues them, and then when he catches up with them, he asks Jacob, "Why did you flee secretly and trick me and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine line?" You can see the lies coming out of here. Now, he wasn't for celebration. He wanted to get as much of the riches from Jacob as he can. But the bottom line is, while Jacob wrestles with God, God slowly tells him, "Hey, it's futile for you to wrestle with me, because you, as a supplanter, a deceiver, a heel grabber, will find out. You'll have a taste of your own medicine." And sure enough, Laban tricked him several times. And even now at this point, Jacob is still trying to wrestle with God, trying to manipulate things in order for things to go his way. Even if Laban took off, Jacob was still trying to fend for his family and think he can accomplish it without God. So we go into the continuation of this wrestling, as he was wrestling there all night with this man. The second movement in his life is what we call a clinging to God. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touches his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This is so loaded. We'll linger here for a while. When the man saw, that man is not an ordinary man. He was not even an angel. He was the God, a theophany or a Christophany, God, actually the Son of God, taking the form of a man so that he can prevail against Jacob. Yeah. And look at what it says. The man, God saw that he did not prevail against Jacob. This is amazing. How in the world can God not prevail over Jacob? He can destroy any. He's omnipotent and be able to do that. And then he touches his hip pocket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint. As he wrestled with him, then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Wow, several lessons here. It's amazing that even if God can force himself on us, he does not. And he allows us to wrestle with him. And out of his grace, when we need to recognize that we really must depend and commit to Him, He breaks and touches her hip socket. You can understand, He did not just break, He just touched it and broke it. You can understand, you're wrestling all night and your hip is affected. It's no longer functional. What happens to you? You cannot wrestle anymore. It was put out of joint as you wrestled with Him. And then finally, Jacob said, I'll stop wrestling. I'll stop wrestling. Instead of wrestling, because he couldn't wrestle anymore, he started clinging and grabbing on to God while he was wrestling. And then God said, hey, the day's breaking, let me go. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. This is what we call the time of Jacob's trouble that we always talk about in the last days. But the bottom line is you got to wrestle with God, actually cling to Him, and tell God, it's only through you that can I have assurance. I can have certainty in these last days, particularly in the coming tribulation. Only you can give me the safety and the deliverance that I need, and I will not let you go unless you bless me. Which takes us to the third movement of Jacob after wrestling with God and manipulating things, being a supplanter and a liar, and then finally being broken by God, dislocating his hip, and can't do anything but just cling to God. He finally learned the art of what we call nestling in God. And he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. The story becomes really kind of amusing here. Did Jacob win? His hip is dislocated. He was the loser in the wrestling match. And here comes the proclamation of Jesus in the gospel. Anyone who loses his life will find it. In the language of God, in order for you to win, in order for you to prevail, you need to lose. That's the story of the wrestling of Jacob. And the moment you lose and cling to God and give everything you have in God and tell God, I got nothing left, Lord, I got nothing left. And all I need to do is nestle in you. By nestling in you, then I will find the blessing that I'm looking for. And as the story continues, it says, the sun rose, then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. Something very interesting here. God says, your name is Jacob. The first question, what's your name? He needed for Jacob to admit that he was a supplanter, he was a liar, he was a manipulator. He needed to confess who he was. And then God said, now that you recognize who you are, I will change you. I will change your name into Israel, because you have prevailed. You eventually lost yourself so that you can find me. I will bless you. And then he asked God, what is your name? God didn't give his name. But really, God did not need to give his name, because he eventually knew, like Jacob said, I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. So what does it mean when Jacob say, tell me your name? It's not so much knowing whether Yod-Heh-Vah-Teh, is it Yahweh, is it Elohim? That was not what you're looking for. Name in the Bible is character, the personality of somebody. When you're given a name as a supplanter, you're a supplanter, you're it. You're a chief, you're a cheat, you're a deceiver. So the moment he asked God, please tell me your name, he already realized that it was God he was wrestling with face to face. What Jacob was trying to say is, tell me your name, tell me about you, make me understand who you are. And by knowing you, then I can nestle in the fact that you're my God, who will always be with me. The sun rose upon him as he past Penuel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. According to the records in Genesis, from that day on, Jacob had a limp. He couldn't walk straight. He had to limp all the way until he died. Big lesson, big takeaway. Sometimes the Lord needs to come to us and dislocate our hips, give us a limp, so that by limping we remember to be dependent on God. What's your limp today? You can remember Peter. He told Jesus, "Oh, no, Lord. Everybody will flee away from you. They will run away, but never, not on my watch. Over my dead body, not touch you." But what was the limp of Peter? It was the cock crow. As soon as the rooster crowed, every time Peter hears a rooster crow, that was his limp. Every time Jacob walks, that limp tells him how gracious God was to reach out to him. So some of us, if not all of us, has this limp to some degree or another. And if you allow God to give us this limp so that we can remember that we're supposed to commit to him, that's where the blessing is. The blessing is in that limp, because it will remind you that God will always be there for you. So how this story ends. Jacob said, "No, please, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand, for I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me." You know the story, right? Jacob sends his flocks and the rest of his family out of them, so that if Esau comes and attacks them, Esau had 400 men with him, of course, strong men with him, he had no chance against his brother. Then they can run away and at least escape by the ford of Jabbok. But Esau, instead of killing him, was so glad to see Jacob. And Jacob started giving all the goats and all the animals and all the livestock he prepared as a gift to his brother. And Esau said, "I don't need that. I got my own. I got my own city." You know, the Edomites were there. But Jacob insisted, "Please, please, please. I found favor in your sight. Then accept my present from my hand." Oh, it's amazing what he says. "For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God." A brother he exploited now gives him forgiveness. And that forgiveness is a reflection of the forgiveness that God has given Jacob, as he learned, after wrestling, to cling and to nestle in God. So Esau said, "Let me leave some of my men with you." And then Jacob said, "Why do that? Oh, I don't need protection anymore. My Lord has already been kind enough to me. All that matters to me is that you've forgiven me. That's what matters, not how much you can give me anymore. I'm not after your possessions. I'm not after your protection. I'm happy that you've forgiven me and you've been kind to me." So what was the next step of Jacob's? "And then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answers me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone." Beautiful story. At the end of Jacob's movement to God, as he wrestled almost all of his life to manipulate things, to deceive people, to achieve things on his own skills and his smarts, he learns that he cannot do it. He needs to depend on God. So God eventually wrestles with him, dislocates his hip so that he can begin to cling to God, because he needed God. Now, after clinging to God, God changes his name and blesses him. And of course, the response of Jacob is to worship, to build an altar to God. Remember the story of his grandfather, Abraham? And there was a word picture, an enacted parable, so to speak, during the covenant with Abraham. They cut animals into halves, and they were supposed to walk in between the the pieces of those animals, saying, as it were, hey, if I violate the covenant, may this happen to me, what happened to these animals. Okay, that's how strong and binding the covenant was. You know the story, right? Abraham fell asleep into a deep sleep, and when he wakes up, he sees a torch. God walks in the middle of the divided animals, and he fulfills the covenant himself. So the same God that Jacob wrestled with is the same God who actually fulfills the covenant for you if you will only trust in him and lose your life for him. My favorite quote, shared this in my Facebook post today, from Howard Hendricks. He actually took this from Corrie ten Boom, written in his Bible. But he says, the Christian life is not difficult. It is impossible. You think you can wrestle with God and win against God? It's impossible. It is a supernatural life. When I try, I fail. But when I trust, God succeeds. You want to understand what it means to nestle in God after wrestling and clinging to him? Recognize that it is impossible to live the Christian life. It is a supernatural life that needs to be lived. And the way to live it is not by trying, because you will fail, but by trusting, so that God succeeds and he gets all the glory. Remember what we covered so many times in our lesson preview. Surrender is not a battle of the will. It is an act of worship. When Jacob finally realized that he was God and began to worship God and committed everything to God, then he understood. Okay, in view of God's mercy, he offered himself as a living sacrifice, as a proper worship to God. Let's review two of the quotes that has been very, very moving to me, very important, and I think very valuable, especially as we live in these last days. Cast yourself at his feet with a cry, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. You can never perish while you do this. Never. How do you win in the Christian life? As you wrestle with God, you cast yourself at the feet of Jesus and tell him, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. Don't do it by sheer willpower or manipulation, whatever you can, by sheer achievement. You can't. You got to cast yourself at the feet of Jesus and say, hold, Lord, help me believe you some more. And when you do this, the promise is you will never, never perish. You have a little assurance that you will be with Jesus. Nothing is apparently more helpless, yet really more invincible than the soul that feels its nothingness and relies wholly on the merits of the Savior. Your hip needs to be dislocated. God needs to make you understand that without him, you cannot live, you cannot survive. And by the time you get to that point, you become invincible. That's the paradox. The moment you realize that you're weak, you can't do anything, that's the point where you become invisible, because by prayer, by the study of his word, by faith in his abiding presence, the weakest of human beings may live in contact with the living Christ, and he will hold them by a hand that will never let go. I love this passage. Look at the last part. If you do this, cast yourself at Jesus every day, through constant communion and prayer and Bible study and faith in him, he will hold you with a hand that will never let go. We just came from Hawaii, attended the wedding of my nephew. And of course, my grandkids were with us. And Rosie's favorite question to me is, Grandpa, will you always protect us? They get scared of animals. They get scared. Well, they say, of course, I'll be there. And she hugs me and I carry her. And I will always be with you. Nothing. I mean, if something goes all right, I will not let go of my granddaughter, the precious, precious granddaughter, because I will hold her with a hand that will not let go. Nobody will take her and harm her as she is in my arms. I mean, it's a very, very small picture of what God promises. The moment God holds on to you because your hip has been dislocated, because God showed you how to lose your life in order to gain it, he will not let go. And when he not let go, you will be sure that you will be with him forever. So what's the take home? Take home is, there are three movements in our lives, and this is the story of our lesson in Jacob part 2. In order for Jacob to turn into Israel, you need to learn not only to wrestle with God, but to cling to him and nestle in him. Just one more word before we end. Notice when Abram's name was changed to Abraham, he was always called Abraham from then on. When Sarai was changed to Sarah, he was called Sarah from then on. In fact, when Peter was changed from Simon to Peter, he was no longer called Simon, he was called Peter. When Saul became Paul, he was no longer called Paul. It's amazing, though, that the moment Jacob is renamed Israel by God, you will keep on reading in the Old Testament the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. There you go. He's called Jacob again, even if his name was already changed to Israel. I think there's a reason for that. Reason for that is Jacob is like his limp. He must remember that he was a supplanter before, a deceiver, a heel grabber. And yet through God's grace, God has changed him to prevail against God and men, prevail in the sense that he has learned to lose his life for God's sake so that he can find it. My prayer to you as you watch this lesson preview and go into this Sabbath school lesson this weekend is to quit wrestling with God and instead cling to him. And not only cling because of his intervention in his life, learn to nestle in God. I don't know how true this is, but there was an anecdote about Oprah Winfrey. Supposedly Oprah Winfrey interviewed Billy Graham. And in the interview, Oprah Winfrey said towards the end of the show, let us end our show differently today. Instead of the extra from the directors of the set, let's sing Amazing Grace. And the audience sang Amazing Grace for the Oprah Winfrey show. And as the cameras were fading, you can see Oprah Winfrey go to Billy Graham, and according to that anecdote, nestling on the shoulders of Billy Graham. You know, it's one thing to wrestle with God and cling to him. It's another to nestle in him. The moment you start nestling in God's shoulders, you know that you're one with him. And that's true to with my grandkids. The moment one of my grand boy, my grandson, he has tantrums every so often. He doesn't like what I'm telling him or asking him to do. He goes on the floor, puts his face on the floor. And I pick him up. It's very difficult to pick him up. You know what the solution is? I mean, I can only feel that everything's okay as soon as he goes into my hands and gets his face and lands that face on my shoulder. And he starts nestling there. Things are fine. So my prayer for you who studied the lesson for this coming Sabbath, right now, as you're watching this, is that we will learn not only to cling to God, but also to nestle in him. And by doing so, we can rest assured that he will always be with us, not only today, but even when he comes back to usher us into eternity, that we might be able to find home with him until forever. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Dear Father, thank you for this time that we've spent in the very powerful story in the Old Testament about Jacob wrestling with God. The Lord teaches, dear Father, if we are still wrestling today, manipulating, deceiving, exploiting, stop wrestling, but instead cling to you And if you need to dislocate our hips, that we might see your greatness and our nothingness, whatever it takes, dear Father, do it, that we might learn not only to cling to you, but cry out, I will never let you go until you bless me, until you show me how to nestle in your shoulders and be with you. To this end, dear Father, bless us as we study this lesson. May we also go through the 3 movements that Jacob went through, and in the end, find ourselves safe in the arms of God. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.